The business that follows that in the order of business is another motion by Honorable Caleb Kositan, and the motion is on the establishment of policy guidelines on land for expansion of public schools and a fund for acquisition of such land. The debate on this had already begun, and this morning it will continue. The time allocated for that particular business this morning is 1 hour 27 minutes. That aware that land is one of the most important resources in Kenya, from which the country generates goods and services and a source of livelihood for many people. Further aware that land is a scarce resource which is highly sought for various economic and commercial purposes, leaving little or no space for establishment of social amenities, including learning institutions, cognizant of the Ministry of Education guidelines, which provide that the amount of school land should be sufficient, with the minimum amount of land required being determined by enrollment. The member is concerned that the increasing number of students in learning institutions puts a lot of strain on the available infrastructure, especially those institutions which are established in a limited space with no space for future expansion. If you're just joining us, these are live pictures from the National Assembly chambers, and on your screen is the Deputy Speaker Moses Chiboy walking into the chambers, ready to oversee the business of the House this morning. This broadcast is brought to you by Parliamentary. The saying of the prayer, just like you have watched, the Speaker shall order the bell to be rung for 10 minutes, and if no quorum is present at the expiration of the 10 minutes, the Speaker may direct that the bell be rung for a further 5 minutes, and if there is still no quorum present, the Speaker shall adjourn the House forthwith to the next sitting. And quorum during the proceedings of the House, this is just for the purposes of the standing orders, getting to understand what the standing orders are. Standing order number 35 talks about the quorum during the proceedings of the House. If at any time after the chair is taken or when the House is in committee, a member objects that there is not enough not quorum present, the Speaker of the or the chairperson shall count the members in the House or the committee as the case may be. So we are still waiting for that number 50 to be achieved, and what happens in the background is that respective leadership in the House, both the minority and the majority, their work is to mobilize their members to come into the chambers to allow us. Njagwa Kanyi will also be moving a motion before the House this morning on the establishment of apprentice testing and certification centers in constituencies, that this House urges the government to establish suitably located and facilitated training and testing centers in every constituencies to assess the experience and competence of the apprentice workers, particularly in the informal sector, and consider putting in place mechanisms to have them awarded with certificates based on their competencies and acquired skills. The member is going to be moving that particular motion this morning, that aware that the informal sector constitutes an important component of the economic activities and development process in Kenya, representing about 82.7% of employment in the country. Further aware that the workers in the informal sector engage in commercial activities outside the realm of the formally established mechanism, since there is no clear policy framework in place to regulate the operations by the government, noting that most workers in the informal sector acquire skills and knowledge mainly through apprenticeship, but have no access to technical skills upgrading, as many lack requisite academic certificates. Recognizing that apprenticeship is the informal, or the apprenticeship in the informal economy represents the main roadmap to skills development in most developing countries, and appreciating that the National Industrial Training Authority, also known as NITA, through its training centers in Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, and Athi River, plays an important role in industrial training targeting workers in the formal and informal sectors. This House urges the government to establish suitably located and facilitated training and testing centers in every constituency to assess the experience and competence of the apprenticed workers, particularly in the informal sector, and consider putting in place mechanisms to have them awarded with certificates based on their competencies and acquired skills. That particular motion will be moved and debated this morning, and the motion is courtesy of the Member of Parliament, Charles Njagwa. The County Pension Scheme Bill, National Assembly Bill number 49 of 2017, is also in the order of business. Quorum has been achieved.
Order, members. Order. Order. Order, members. Order. We now have the required quorum, and therefore business will begin.
Order number 1, administration of oath. Order number 2, communication from the chair. Order number 3, messages. Order number 4, petitions.
Order, members, under this particular order, we have Honorable Mbui, the member for Kadhiani.
Yeah, thank
and
you.
Deputy Minority Leader.
Thank you for the recognition, Mr. Speaker, sir. This is a petition regarding compensation to victims and survivors of the High Court ruling on 3rd March 2016. The court awarded 40,950,000 shillings as compensation to the victims and survivors of the Changuli dormitory fire, jointly and severally, and broke affected families who have been living in trauma of the loss of their loved ones, and survivors of the tragedy will receive compensation awarded to them by the High Court. 8, that if this matter is left unresolved, the petitioners risk being victims of justice delayed, which is the same as justice denied. 9, that issues in respect of this petition are not pending before any court of law or constitutional or statutory body. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, your humble petitioners pray that this National Assembly, through the...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to comment on this particular petition and to congratulate the Honorable Robert Mbue for that petition. Mr. Speaker, people have been going to courts, at times they are given awards, and when it comes to payment, has been a problem. Maybe it's the highest time they come.
Let me see, Honorable Pukose from this other side. And I probably will be giving 2 more members because I see they seem to be...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand to support this petition by the Honorable Robert Mbui. Mr. Speaker, is on legal affairs. Even have a tracking system for some of the compensations, because we have compensations that are very old of other cases that the judgments have been made. People are supposed to be compensated, and even some...
No, you don't.
Yeah, thank you.
Are
Thank
you
you.
in the House?
Thank you, Mr.
Members, don't sit in different... I mean, don't be pastoralists. You know, there will be an assumption that I didn't see you because I expected you to be in the seat where Dr. Makali Muli normally, you know, sits.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I thought we have
a
free seating
yes, the majority. What is it?
arrangement.
I know this term pastoralism really evokes your emotion. What is it?
Speaker, you have made a very serious statement. You asked him, don't be like a pastoralist.
I did not say that. I said, don't be a pastoralist.
On a serious note, let me support this petition. And I want to thank Honorable Mbui for bringing this petition to this House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, looking at the time it has taken for this compensation to be done, I think the committee, JILAC, needs to act very fast, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, looking at the amount we are talking about, It's only about 40 million, Mr. Speaker. And these are children who lost their lives. And we just wanted to give the family some small token. I would call it actually token of appreciation because they lost their loved ones. Just to appreciate the fact that they have lost lives and they went through a bit of stress as a result of those deaths, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I really want to support this petition and urge this House or the committee to support the payments to the families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Martin Owino, member for Ndiwa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join my voice to this petition, and I thank Honorable Mbui for this. Mr. Speaker, generally, victims of attack of this kind, some people have died, some people have lost their limbs. I refer to my case, and there were so many victims have not been compensated. Some have lost their livelihood through animals, sesefly, and all this. So, Mr. Speaker, as it is being said that the Committee of Justice and Legal Affairs should take action, I think we should be a little bit strategic. What action are they going to take? And there are so many things pending on their desk. Are they unable to do it, or what is going on? So my submission, Mr. Speaker, is that compensation is not a privilege, especially when it goes through the legal means, whether it's committees or the court system, and the victims are awarded, they should be compensated. It is not a privilege. Thank you.
Since I see there is a lot of interest in this one, I'll give two more members. We will start with the Honorable Pauletta Correre. I didn't know there was such a member.
From their various circumstances. But, Mr. Speaker, the government appears not to be serious in sorting out these issues. One of my constituents, a former member of parliament, who was detained by Kanu government, was awarded resources, was compensated. But, Mr. Speaker, when it came to payment, he was being given little amounts of money every year. Until to date, Honorable Marco Nyango has not been fully compensated. So, Mr. Speaker, in my considered opinion, this House should not even appropriate resources to buy tea in government offices if victims of torture, victims of terror, fire victims have not been compensated. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious issue, and I want to plead with the committee in charge, the Committee for JLAC, that in the next budget, let them not appropriate resources for tea in the various offices of government if victims of terror of this nature who are owed money by government have not been compensated.
Okay.
Thank you, I support.
Lastly, Honorable Manzo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me a chance to comment on this very important petition. Mr. Speaker, I watched a brief in this matter as a young lawyer, and I can assure you most of the parents perished for having lost their children, high blood pressure as they waited, and it's a very weighty matter. My experience with this sort of compensation, Mr. Speaker, a lot of times as a practicing lawyer, we had to get contempt of court proceedings against the Solicitor General for it even to be put in the budget. So I think the committee should now come up with a structure, Mr. Speaker, so that compensations can be budgeted in advance, or a fund is provided, because definitely there will be orders against the courts, from the courts against the government and the Office of Solicitor General in this particular matter, so that they have some money which can be able to compensate people who get caught on. Otherwise, the challenge is usually it's not budgeted for, it's not likely to be budgeted for soon. So I really would like also to join JLAC in this deliberation so that I can be useful to them. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very well. Next order.
Order number 5, papers. Order number 6, notices of motion. Order number 7, questions and statements.
This particular one? This particular order, specifically questions, we will start with Honorable Zuleika Hassan, a member for Kwale County. Ask your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I wish to ask the following questions to the relevant cabinet secretaries. To the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure, Housing and urban development.
What is it, leader?
Speaker, have you heard the member said the following cabinet secretaries? You need to tell us which cabinet secretary. They are not following.
Well, she
They are
has
specific.
2 questions. And
Yeah,
she
but,
has
each
indicated
question-
that
each
the
question-
first one is going to the transport and infrastructure. She
Yeah, so
actually-
she said that transport and infrastructure.
Yes, proceed.
They are not following cabinet secretary.
Yes, our member should actually remember to be pointing out the specific cabinet secretaries. But in this particular one, I thought you actually said it. I thought I heard you, but proceed.
Yeah, just because I was speaking, Honorable Speaker, but if I was writing the question, I would have put following cabinet secretaries and a colon, and then followed to list them, and I had started with the first one. So the 3 are the cabinet secretary for transport, infrastructure, housing, and urban development, the cabinet secretary for water and irrigation.
No, just let's deal with one, because you'll have an opportunity to deal with.
Thank you, because that's how I was proceeding, Mr.
Yes,
Speaker. Thank
yes.
you. For the cabinet secretary for transport, infrastructure, and housing and urban development, when will the resident?
Order again. Why are you honorable members? Honorable Washiali, what is it?
Mr. Speaker, I am rising on a point of order because I think the House needs to be guided. Mr. Speaker, you know, the current House was not there when we used to ask questions. The aspect of giving
Majority whip. But, you know, the practice in this parliament has been such that actually no member has been placing that particular one. But I think it's something that we could start with Zuleika today, so that she becomes the first one. Just pointing the fact that it is a question, a certain specific number of questions, for purposes of record. For just purposes of record. It's okay, but you are moving very well anyway. So just proceed, Honorable Zuleika, but you need to indicate, especially in the next one, the specific number of the question, and of course to which cabinet secretary. Proceed, you are doing well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand guided and I don't mind being a pioneer in this. So I'll start from the beginning. Question number 055/2018. Question directed to the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure, Housing and Urban Development. When will the residents of Mwamdudu area in Kwale County who were affected during the construction of the standard gauge railway be compensated?
Very well.
Question 056.
So on that particular one, before you go to the next one, this will be replied, of course, before the Departmental Committee on Transport, Public Works and Housing. Proceed to the next question.
Okay, thank you. Question 056/2018. Question directed to the Cabinet Secretary for Water and Irrigation. When will the residents of Mwache area, Kwale County, who were affected by the construction of Mwache Dam be compensated?
Very well. This particular one will be replied before the Departmental Committee on Environment and Natural Resources. Thank you very much, Honorable Zuleika. We go to the next one. Honorable Member for Kuresoi South.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for giving me this opportunity to ask this question, 085/2018. I wish to ask the Cabinet Secretary for Sports, Culture and Arts, why has the construction of Olengurwan Stadium?
My question is question number 88 of 2018, and I'm seeking answers from Cabinet Secretary for Tourism and Wildlife. Is the Cabinet Secretary aware that the late Hussein Abdi Hussein from Mandera South constituency was attacked by a lion in Biliko location, Merti Sub-County, Isiolo County on 17 September 2018, and later on succumbed to his injuries and died while undergoing treatment? If aware, when will the family of the deceased be compensated for the loss? B, owing to the many incidences of animal-wildlife conflict,
I don't seem to be following you.
B, what measures has the ministry put in place to mitigate human-wildlife conflict in the country, and what is the effectiveness of the measures
Yes,
that the ministry is taking?
And honorable members should
Thank you
stick
very
to the
much,
questions.
Honorable Speaker.
members should not modify the questions that they bring before the House. Once you have put it and it is in the order paper, you will read it as it is. Any other subsidiary questions can come at the committee. So that will be replied before the Departmental Committee on Environment and Natural Resources. I think that marks the end of the question time. So next order.
Order number 8, motion, strengthening of rehabilitation schools in the country. Question to be put.
This particular motion had been transacted, honorable members, and I confirm that we have the requisite numbers. And therefore, I put the question, which is aware that several buildings in government secondary schools in the country have had fire incidences this year, many of which being arson incidents attributable to students' delinquency. Further aware that the learning in the affected schools have been severely interfered with, disturbed that the number of students arrested for alleged burning or conspiring to burn school buildings around the country continue to rise, cognizant that the students are aged below 18 years of age, therefore fall under the category of juvenile offenders, further cognizant that Article 53(1)(f) of the Constitution provides that every child has the right not to be detained except as a measure of last resort, and when detained, to be held for the shortest appropriate period of time, separate from adults in conditions that take account to child sex and age, appreciating that Section 18(2) of the Children's Act provide that the child offender shall be separated from adult in custody, and further appreciating that the Children's Act 2001 advances protection of children from any action deemed hazardous or likely to interfere with child's education, health, among others, and deeply concerned that the delinquency tends to lead to adult crime, thereby encouraging the possibility of lifelong career if not managed appropriately. This House resolved that the national government puts in place administrative measures to ensure that child offenders are not remanded or incarcerated in adult remands, and strengthens the existing rehabilitation schools in the country as a measure to ensure delinquent adolescents are effectively rehabilitated while making them accountable for their crimes. Will as many as of that opinion say aye? Aye. Many as of a contra opinion say nay? The ayes have it. Next order.
Order number 9, motion, establishment of policy guidelines on land for expansion of public schools and a fund for acquisition of such land. A resumption of debate interrupted on Wednesday, October 17, 2018.
Very well. On this particular one, there is a balance of time of 1 hour, 27 minutes. And when the debate was close to an end last time, Honorable Adan Sheikh, Mohammed Mahmoud Sheikh was on the floor. If he's in the floor, if he's around, he has 3 minutes, a balance of 3 minutes. I do not see him, and therefore I proceed to give a member for Wajir West, if he is interested in speaking to this one. Member for Wajir West? Member for Wajir West? Are you interested in speaking to this particular one? I see he has no interest absolutely, and he has actually put off the mic. So I'll proceed and give Honorable Murugara Kitonga, member for Tharaka.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to contribute to this motion and thank the Honorable Caleb Kostanyi for presenting the same to this House. It is true that land matters in Kenya are very important and emotive, and most of the time when we talk about land, especially for acquisition, it does evoke very strong reactions from the landowners, and especially when it is designated for use for public purposes. The greatest sufferer of lack of land for public utilities are actually education institutions. In arid and semi-arid areas, we do not have a problem as far as land is concerned because most of it is available and schools and other institutions are able to benefit from the abundance of that land. But when it comes to land in agricultural rich areas, then schools and other institutions are actually deprived of land that they can use for their expansion, as a result of which many or most of the learning institutions are confined to small pieces of land. The net effect is that these schools cannot expand, these schools do stagnate, and in fact, they are not able to cope with the enrollment which rises from time to time as population increases. The net effect is that these schools then have to branch off, and as they branch off, more problems of land ownership are actually established. It is therefore vitally important that the government does devise and put in place a mechanism of compulsory land acquisition. This is under the various land laws that we have in the country and the regulations made thereunder as far as land acquisition is concerned. Once the land is compulsorily acquired, then it becomes mandatory that the owners are compensated. Without a clear policy on how the owners are to be compensated, then the policy is likely to be marred in protracted legal battles as far as the owners are concerned. But with a clear guideline that is acceptable, a guideline that possibly has gone through this House, debated on and approved, then these institutions will actually benefit from that acquisition and the subsequent compensation that is likely to be given to the landowners. We have gone through and we have had questions in this House of the government acquiring land and failing to compensate the public. This is prevalent because this morning we have had a question in Kwale where land belonging to citizens was acquired for purposes of the SGR and no compensation has been given. It follows exactly where land is acquired for purposes of either schools, learning institutions, or colleges, that there must be compensation. It's also important to note that it's not just learning institutions that require land to be compulsorily acquired.
Cannot be expanded anymore, Mr. Speaker. This is mainly as a result of historical poor planning and land grabbing in this country and lack of vision on the part of planners who planned for these institutions in the past. Mr. Speaker, some of the schools are also in small portions of land because by the time of their establishment, there was simply no land. And it is a challenge, Mr. Speaker, to many of us, especially members of parliament, who are now having to struggle with their meager CDF to try and acquire land for these schools, Mr. Speaker. And I want to be very practical, Mr. Speaker, because many may doubt the extent of this problem. In my own constituency, Mr. Speaker, I have more than 7 schools that I'm currently struggling with. I have a school by name Kirogo, that is sitting on a 1-acre land. I have a school called Nyaga Secondary, Muga Primary, Kango Primary, which is proposed, Kangodo proposed again, Kangure Secondary, and many more that I'm struggling to get land. Mr. Speaker, if I were to put my CDF to the needs that we have for land in my constituency, then I would not be able to do anything else, Mr. Speaker. And it's for this reason that I support this motion, that we need to put some mechanism in place so that we can identify all the needs out there, document them, and present them to the government so that land can be acquired, and there are many ways of acquiring land, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a high time we also look at.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like Honorable Speaker to support this motion. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the significance of education, and particularly, Mr. Speaker, public education, which by its very nature seeks to meet the needs of all citizens, regardless of perhaps their ability to go into private schools, I'd like, Mr. Speaker, to support this motion, and in particular, Mr. Speaker, to indicate that these
several schools in my constituency that are even falling prey to foreigners who masquerade as and assume they're going to help these schools. I have one school, that Kanyuki Primary School, whereby a foreigner or a foreign country or a foreign contractor has even erected a flag of their country in that school, in the assumption that they're going to help that school. It's become a big issue in our society. We seem to be auctioning our country to foreigners who pretend that they're going to help us. So really, we have to come up with a policy, rules, regulations to make sure that we are able to acquire land that is adjacent to schools or school land. On the issue of fund, we have CDF, Constituency Development Fund, that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is not equitably shared out among constituencies. Some of us are so disadvantaged. A constituency with 8 wards, we get the same allocation with a constituency with 3 wards. A constituency with about 50,000 households gets an equivalent with a constituency with about 10,000 households. And we expected to spend our money on schools and maybe bring out projects that are going to touch the lives of our people in equal measures. So there is that inequitability. And maybe to heal and to cure such, we'll need to have a fund like the one that is proposed in this motion by Honorable Caleb, so that then it's going to act like an equalization fund for schools, so that schools that do not have land and CDF is not enough, then they can draw from that kitty and help in acquisition of land and expansion. I therefore wish to support this motion. And finally, I have a school in town that doesn't have land for expansion. The ministry needs to come up with policies that really are going to address such areas that are growing and there's no land to expand, so that then we can have enough for expansion and development of our schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to support.
Very well, Honorable Koros. Sigawit Soin.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me this opportunity. I wish to stand to contribute to this motion and say for sure land is a very important issue in this country. Also, land is a scarce commodity, Mr. Speaker, in this country. But this motion, Mr. Speaker, is so timely, since we are all coming from constituencies where most of our schools are really having issue with land. And acquiring this land for these schools is a big challenge, Mr. Speaker. Most of our funding in CDF, we tend to put in constructions and also to acquire land. And having policies now, Mr. Speaker, for acquiring this school land is very important. Population in most schools in the Republic, Mr. Speaker, is growing. And it's very important that we have policies of making sure we enlarge the land for schools, Mr. Speaker. I just say, Mr. Speaker, that this motion is very important, it's timely, and I support, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Very well. Let's have Honorable Bayaya.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. And I would like to speak on this motion and say that while it is very important that the Ministry of Education has policy guidelines, these guidelines cannot be put in place alone. Looking at social amenities, which include schools. And therefore, you find that after some time, this place requires a school. But in the planning, the physical planning that was done did not put any land at all for the development of schools or shopping centers or social halls or mosques or churches. So before we start looking at what Ministry of Education should do, we need to engage the Ministry of Lands to be able to understand issues about planning. The other important aspect that you need to look at is what are county governments who are in charge of communal land doing in terms of reserving land for school development. Today, there's a lot of land subdivisions and adjudication and settlement schemes that are going on. And you know the mandate of county government in survey and planning. We need to see how we can dovetail that such that school properties are made available during the subdivision and surveys. Mr. Speaker, you also would want to be interested to look at the cost and the pricing of land in this country. Today, if you want to start, if my friend TJ wants to start a school in his place, in his constituency, he would pay billions of shillings to acquire probably 5 acres. Why? Because the cost of land in this country is gone through the rooftop. And we need to in the land value index bill as soon as possible to this house so that it is passed, so that we can regulate the cost of land, especially when it comes to acquiring land for institutions. Because without doing that, in the future, Nairobi may not be able to develop even one new school, one new primary school or secondary school, because of the exorbitant prices that are associated to land in this country. And the prices of land in this country have actually brought down development, because for you to acquire land, like we have seen in the standard gauge railway, you need to have more money to purchase the land than the money for the project. And this is what is happening. And in future, you realize that we will not have public schools because of the lack of space for developing public schools. New towns are coming up, and you can see that county governments are licensing new towns and they are developing new towns, but if you check the population against the number of public utilities being put there, they are not in congruence completely. They forget that you'll need a secondary school, you will need a primary school, you'll need a kindergarten, or that. So, Mr. Speaker, as these policies are being urged to be developed, we need to look at it from a larger perspective and the larger picture, such that the Minister of Land and the Minister of Education sit together to look at this whole aspect from a holistic perspective, so that as government sets out funds, because the motion says that government should set out funds for purchase of land for schools, it knows actually how much land is required in the next 10 years that will be used for development of schools, and how much money should be factored in the budget, so that we have a holistic picture in the development of the policy. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members, we'll have the next one is Honorable Atandi Onunga, member for Alego Usonga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to observe that you are not balancing very well. You know, we have government on both sides. So if you are pointing out majority side, 3 majority side, 3 minority side. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to support this motion because this motion is timely and a very, very important motion. Right now, Mr. Speaker, members are aware that we are trying to expand our primary schools to secondary schools because of government policy on 100% transition from primary to secondary schools. And Mr. Speaker, we are forced to construct secondary schools on the pieces of land where primary schools are currently existing. And Mr. Speaker, it has become very difficult for us to acquire land because the land where the primary schools are existing is not sufficient enough for the secondary schools. And the government policy on construction of secondary schools is such that you are expected to have equivalent piece of land as the one where the primary schools exist. So having a policy on funding for public schools is very, very important, and again I want to thank Honorable Kositanyi for this. So as a government, we really need to think about this and set aside resources that is going to help us to meet. Our CDF resources is not sufficient, and I know for most of the colleagues who have tried, it's not been enough. We have been forced to conduct fundraisings, arambes, which are not sustainable. So this is something that we really would like the government to adopt immediately. The Parliament passes this. But, Mr. Speaker, the other issue which we should not run away from is that even as we talk, there are matters before courts touching on government officers who continue to grab public land. And some of the pieces of land that have been grabbed by senior government officers involve land that belong to schools, belong to serious government amenities. And, Mr. Speaker, as a House, we must make a decision and call on anybody in government, whether you are who and who, if you have grabbed any piece of land, please ensure that this land is returned and this land is recovered. In this way, Mr. Speaker, we will be playing a proactive role in helping the government to manage public land, and especially land that touches on public resources. I want to say that land is one subject that has been adversely canvassed in this country. It has been canvassed more than any other item, more than any other subject right now. Every day, I don't think there's any piece of newspaper, our dailies, that do not talk about land. So we have to be very serious as a House and insist that we must also protect our public land. And so I would like to say that if this House can appropriate resources, specifically for expansion of schools, it would really go a long way in helping us to ensure that our schools are.
Very well. So we will get the member for Narok South.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for giving me this opportunity. Honorable Speaker, I indeed also want to thank the Honorable Kositany, Mr. Speaker, for coming up with this particular motion. Mr. Speaker, I truly want to agree with him that this issue of land in this country is becoming extremely scarce. And Mr. Speaker, if some of us who are coming from the so-called pastoral regions can feel it, Mr. Speaker, what about those people who are coming from densely populated regions? Honorable Speaker, I indeed want to agree with him that indeed the government need to come up with a policy, at least to come up with a fund that will be able to assist on matters land expansion, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I believe almost every member of this House has an experience on matters CDF. And Honorable Speaker, there is a time that you are torn between buying a piece of land and building a classroom also. So it becomes a challenge, Honorable Speaker. The schools, the CMCs of the school want you to buy a piece of land for the school, and at the same time, Mr. Speaker, they want you to construct a classroom. So it becomes a really big challenge. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, this particular motion, Mr. Speaker, it will intend to address the same challenges. And Mr. Speaker, as some of the early speakers have actually alluded, that for us to move forward, even as the Ministry of Education put on policies and structures on matter schools, Mr. Speaker, what is very important as well is a physical planning act, Mr. Speaker. Because even if we buy, funds are put in place to buy land, funds are put in place to actually increase the number of acreages or so forth. Still, Mr. Speaker, you can imagine the challenge we have at the moment when we have a population of almost 50 million Kenyans. In the next, this particular area. Mr. Speaker, we are talking about primary schools. We are also talking about secondary schools. Mr. Speaker, even on tertiary education, where we are moving to, it is becoming also a challenge as well, that we cannot even access land, Mr. Speaker, to be able to develop some of these very important institutions, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, without much ado, I do support this motion.
Very well. So next would be member from Watate.
Asante sana Mheshimiwa Spika kwa hii fursa. Kimbele kabisa namka kwa kuiunga mkono hii hoja. Mheshimiwa Spika, ukiangalia madhumuni, malengo, nia, shabaha, mawazo tangu miaka ya 60, miaka 70, miaka 80, miaka ya 90 na kwenda mbele yamekuwa yakibadilika. Manake hata mbeleni mfumo wetu wa elimu ulikuwa 7, 4, 2, 3. Ukabadilika ukaja 8, 4, 4. Vile vile ardhi haijaachwa. Manake wakati mnabadilisha mfumo wa elimu lazima pia na ardhi kidogo itatofautiana. Mheshimiwa Spika, ni vyema serikali kutunga sheria na vile vile na mwongozo mwafaka, mwongozo thabiti ambao unaweza kusaidia zile shule ambao miaka 60, 70 na 80 na 90 labda idadi ya watu hapo ilikuwa kidogo, lakini kwa sasa hivi imeongezeka. Serikali tenge hela ya kununua ardhi ya kupanua hizi shule. Badala ya kujenga shule nyingi, zile shule za zamani zikipanuliwa zitaweza kuwa na watoto wengi kuliko hapo mbeleni. Mheshimiwa Spika, aliyeleta hii hoja ameleta wakati mwafaka, manake kuna mambo mengi sana ambaye yanabadilika. So ni vyema sheria, mwongozo wa hizi shule na tujue pangilio ufanyike, mwongozo toke kwamba shule kama ni shule ya msingi iwe na kiasi fulani cha ardhi. Shule ya upili iwe na kiasi gani cha ardhi. Juzi kulikuwa na matapeli wengine kule sehemu zetu kule Mwatate. Wanasema wanataka kutujengea chuo kikuu kutoka kule Amerika, kumbe wameshikana wanataka kuchukua land na walikuwa wanahitaji ekari 1000. Bahati nzuri tuligundua hiyo na tukathibiti. So ingekuwa ni vizuri wizara husika.
When we have tried to acquire more land for such schools, the owners of land surrounding the schools are not willing to move. That's why I support this motion, because we shall come up with regulations leading to compulsory acquisition of land for these schools. And right on the onset, I could suggest that we shall do it in a humane way, where we shall move these people to available land, and if there is any money to be given to such people, they should be cleared before they move. It should not be misconstrued in this House that regulations don't exist. I will refer you to the Education Act. The issue is, in Kenya nowadays, sometimes we don't follow the laws that we have made ourselves. I'll give you the example of the Msila bill, which came through this House about retirees. I'm giving just as an example, where it was recommended that nobody retires and moves out of his or her workstation without clearance in terms of pension and gratuity. But that one has not been effected to date. People are moving out of their workstations without that money. Some of them have died. Some of them have become beggars because they can't even buy drugs when they are sick. And that is exactly what might happen when we pass this law. The laws are there, Mr. Speaker, but we are not willing to follow them. I will also agree with my former honorable member who suggested that instead of putting up classrooms or buildings here and there within the small piece of land, we should think of going upwards, building upwards. We should look for land upwards instead of lateral expansion. I think that one will lead to some savings in terms of land. And I think as we formulate the laws, we should strictly look at densely populated areas like Kisii, where I come from. If anybody says that a primary school should exist on 5 acres, as an example, then no primary school will exist in Kisii. Most schools were divided from primary into primary and secondary, so that we now have 2 separate schools in one piece of land, which is not even adequate. And land is not available. Anything we call public land in other constituencies does not exist, especially where I come from. So we should, as we formulate the regulations or the laws, we should look strictly into densely populated areas and perhaps loosen the regulations as we come up with them. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Mwanyanje Mbeyu, member for Kilifi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this motion on the establishment of policy guidelines on land for expansion on the public schools and a fund for acquisition of the same. Mr. Speaker, it's very important that the motion comes at this time. Mr. Speaker, our public schools are overpopulated. In this public school, Mr. Speaker, we have the ECD section, we have the primary, and also the secondary schools, Mr. Speaker. And as much as we urge the government to put up a fund to acquire land, most of the land, Mr. Speaker, is already populated. People have grabbed land towards the schools, and as much as we want to acquire land, it may not be there. I urge the policy makers, this House, that we establish a policy that our schools make use of the airspace of these schools, make use even the underground. We can do storage infrastructure, boarding facilities, the classes, so that we leave the little land for these schools for playground. Mr. Speaker, as a teacher, the most children, the ECD children, need a lot of land to play, to develop them physically. The primary school children need this land as playgroup. So it's my wish that we use the airspace to do storage buildings for our schools, and more so the underground also can be used to do infrastructure for the classes and boarding facilities, and leave the little land for the playground for our schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Joroge wa Maua, member for Maragua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the chance to support this motion. And let me start by appreciating and commending the mover of the motion, because he has brought the motion just in time. Mr. Speaker, we really need to urge the government to establish these policy guidelines on the rapid expansion of public schools, and also set aside for acquisition of such land. And Mr. Speaker, why I'm supporting the same, it is because of the rising population that we are getting in our primary and secondary schools, especially secondary, after the 100% transition. So most of the children are transiting to Form 1, and therefore, all the time the secondary schools are calling function of the RAD. So, Mr. Speaker, if the government puts a kitty together with the little that the CDF can be able, we can be able to give the schools or to buy for the schools land because there is that comes from the government and there is that the CDF can be able to give along the other project. Mr. Speaker, there is also the issue of improvement for infrastructure like the sporting activity. Mr. Speaker, when you get into the rural areas, you'll find that some of these students and children in primary and secondary schools do not have fields where they can be able to do their sporting activity. To an extent that you find that some of the children get on the road where they are competing with the pedestrians and motorists for them at least to do some sporting activities, and because within 2 or a month, they're going for some competition. And Mr. Speaker, you wonder how the government can really not afford to buy for a school lad to an extent that the children are playing as the pedestrians are passing and also vehicles. Mr. Speaker, sir, even in primary schools, remember, together with the administration that we have, we are calling for all parents to make sure that their children are in school. And that is why we are supporting the free and compulsory. Mr. Speaker, the other day, we adopted a motion whereby we are requesting the government to allow their bee feeding programs in the secondary school. So if this happens, then it means the population will also improve in our schools. So when there is the increase in population, it calls for expansion of land. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, we are supporting this motion. Mr. Speaker, I also want to concur with one of the honorable member who is saying that the Ministry of Education need to be in partner with the Ministry of Land in matters to do with the physical planning, and especially when it comes for the subdivision for communal rights. So that, Mr. Speaker, we leave enough acres or enough land for a school. Mr. Speaker, sometimes you find it is an acre or 2 acres. So this one means very soon it will also be calling for an expansion of land. So, Mr. Speaker, if this happens, then we can see that some of the issues in the future will not be there to call for expansion. So, Mr. Speaker, I support the motion.
The Honorable Nguna Ngusia, member from Mwingi West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir, for giving me this opportunity. I would like to appreciate the motion mover, Honorable Caleb. Indeed, the motion is timely, coming at a time when most of the schools are converting to boarding schools and also facilities. Mr. Speaker, sir, the scarcity of land is even more pronounced in urban schools and schools with rough terrain and also rich agricultural areas. That is why I'm supporting this motion. Mr. Speaker, sir, the motion mover really thought very well, and personally, I'm calling upon for the government to put in place a compulsory land acquisition for schools, especially having less than, or rather operating in less than 5-acre land. And that is why, if this motion is at all passed, it will improve the learning facilities in our country, especially in those schools. Mr. Speaker, sir, most of the schools which require this establishment of this policy will face a lot of challenges, like the owners who are in close proximity to these schools may not be willing to move. But if we can really put adequate compensations policy, or rather timely and prompt compensation policy, I'm sure we can persuade them to do so. Although the CDF, we acknowledge, is too little to buy this kind of land, Mr. Speaker, sir, I would like to request that if we are going to pass the funds, kindly let us have what we call equity. All the constituencies, the fund must be distributed equally.
And with these few remarks, I would like to support and thank you very much. Thank you.
The Honorable Abdi Yusuf, member for Kamukunji.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand to support this motion. It is particularly timely for a neighborhood like mine, where we have a very large population. Kamukunji has one of the largest populations in the country in terms of an area. And we have a serious problem of finding space for the growing number of children who are coming to our schools. And therefore, I feel that it is very important that we get the opportunity to have a regulation. And specifically, I'm more attracted by the element of having a special fund, because land is becoming more expensive. It is more difficult for us to get land in urban areas like Nairobi. And therefore, it will be absolutely necessary in the coming years for us to be able to have the necessary funds to be able to acquire land, to be able to build schools for the growing number of children that we have who would be school going. The other element that I have also looked
playgrounds, so that those who are footballers, those who are athletes in the near future can be developed in primary schools to secondary schools. So we need to establish some money.
True. Failure to have proper policies in terms of guidelines of the land. We don't have sustainable measures in terms of management of our land within the country. The Kenyan jurisdiction, especially institutions, they are under threat of land grabbers and other people by pretense they are land developers. Honorable Speaker, in the land. Honorable Speaker, this motion should not go like other motions, just to be debated in this important house, then no implementation. It is true. If we want our institutions, our people to enjoy, to have that right, to have that moment of being in a compound where they can have a good environment for education, have the resources to give a class or two classes, but no, there is nowhere we can get a land. But when we have a charter, when we have organized policies which will give guidelines on how to get the lands, it will be easier. Because it's not easy to go tell people to migrate to build a school. So we are looking at the government to bring up proper guidelines, and especially with funds to increase the land for our institution. Thank you, Honorable Speaker, and I support this motion.
I hope the Honorable Kositani, who is the owner of this motion, is listening. I believe that if there ever was a case for compulsory acquisition, then this is it. As members are contributing, it's hoped that you will progress this into a bill. We shall have the member for Tigania West.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to this motion. Honorable Speaker, if I was given the chance to sit with Kositani, we would have rewarded this motion as restructuring the design for development of schools in this country. Because, Honorable Speaker, land is not limitless. Land is limited. And I think the way we are doing our schools, the temporal nature of the schools, keeps us growing these schools horizontally instead of growing vertically. The only land space that is available and that is infinite is the space upwards. And, Honorable Speaker, our children live even 11th and 12th floor and 15th floor in some of these estates. And therefore, they are able even to learn from those floors as well. So we need, as a house, to look at how do we come up with the designs for various areas of this country. We need to have designs for the urban centers. We need to have school designs for the peri-urban and the school designs for the rural areas, with anticipation that even the rural areas can become urban. And therefore, in future, we should have, or rather this motion should actually fix the amount of land that should be set aside for a school, in view of the possibilities for growth and development, and therefore the increase in populations. Mr. Speaker, if you realize, our country is young. We are growing in both numbers and in institutions. As we grow, we are taking up the available space. And as we also focused on the space that we need to take, we need to have policy guidelines that are going to help us to grow without limiting this particular possibility of space. Mr. Speaker, even if we are talking about compulsory acquisition, and the government has the muscle to compulsorily acquire land, it doesn't mean that those from whom we take their livelihoods will get equal livelihoods elsewhere. What we need to do is to come up with the policy guidelines that tells us how much do we forecast as a country, and we have experts to tell us this. How much do we forecast that the population of this particular zone will grow? And therefore, we set up school construction guidelines based on the maximum number of population. And therefore, the infrastructural design, and we have super architects in this country, we will basically focus on how do we set up the ground infrastructure, how do we lay foundations for future growth upwards. And then we have fixed land sizes for different zones. So, Mr. Speaker, though I support this motion, I believe it lacks in that particular dimension, and therefore you need to look at it in the next version if we, should it grow into a bill. Mr. Speaker, let me also allude to the fact that most of the land that we have in these schools is not titled. Although there has been effort and government policy to have all the land that belongs to institutions registered with the land registries, some of them do not have titles. And that is why there is encroachment by the unscrupulous Kenyans who want to get more for less. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we should be emphasizing as a house is that all the school land that is there right now should actually be secured. And we give a time limit when it should be secured because we cannot wait or do it forever. There is also the need for us to look at what is happening, especially land from the private schools. Because private schools do not have the muscle to acquire any land, and because they do not have the possibility of setting up a fund, private schools grow to scale. And they grow systematically and they grow realistically. Why don't we focus on what they're doing? There's very few private schools actually growing laterally. They are growing upwards. So, Mr. Speaker, I would also like to bring up to the fact that as we consider looking for more land, we need to look at alternative uses of land. And we need to look at the patterns of growth and development in terms of the population and how we are populating this particular country. Where there is potential for livelihood support systems, that is where we have the people. Where there is minimum potential for livelihood support, that's where we have less people. Why can't we focus in this particular direction? And they have set up guidelines on how to grow. Mr. Speaker, I support the issue of the fund. But the fund should also be focused into restructuring the schools that we have right now. The temporal nature of putting up semi-permanent to, temporary, semi-permanent to permanent classes, we should stop that direction. Mr. Speaker, CDF is not enough to grow schools or develop institutions in this country. We should have serious investment in institutions of learning, especially the primary, the lower institutions of learning, so that we may be able to be a lot more focused and guided as a country. Mr. Speaker, I support those remarks.
Very good contribution. There is a belief out there that the CDF fund is intended and is the be-all for building of schools. We must disabuse the public of that belief, and the government must step up and come up with a clear policy of acquisition of land and building of our schools. Good contribution. The Honorable Luyaya Misi, member for Saboti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise to support this motion from my namesake, Honorable Caleb Kositani. Honorable Speaker, the issue of land has been quite pertinent, and this motion is timely. Most of us come from constituencies that have invested in land. Those who come from Trans Nzoia, Rift Valley, but we are still faced with the problems of land for schools. We've seen before small kids, school children, on the streets, basically running battles with land grabbers or private developers to secure their school's land. And it has been shameful for a country to see small kids on the street fighting for land to be used as playing field. And we've seen also schools developing into, skyscrapers, high buildings because of lack of land. You visit some of our schools, you find some are sharing. You find a staff room being shared as a classroom, and just basically because of not having enough space. So this is, apart from being a motion, I want to propose to the member to fasten so that it becomes a bill and it comes back to this house so that we passed it. We don't just pass motions and we do not implement. So it is a high time, especially this one that touches on our education sector. I think the member for SOE is really timely and will help you to make it that it's implemented. We follow, because this one touches on a very, on a very integral part of our lives of our small children. And it is important for the members to support, and I urge members to support this motion. I support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Yusuf Haji, member for Mandera West. Is not desiring to be in the House. We shall pass on that opportunity to the Honorable Korir Nixon, member for Langata.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this motion. As you're aware that I represent Langata constituency, which is a densely populated constituency representing around 500,000 people. It is surprising that with 500,000 people, we have only 10 primary schools and 3 secondary schools, simply because we don't have land. Land is an issue, and I support this motion because it will give us a solution in terms of having guidelines by the Ministry of Education on what amount of land first a school is entitled to, and also compulsory acquisition of land. In Langata, you'll be surprised that we have government institution with huge chunks of land, but getting a space in Langata even to build a polytechnic or a primary school or an additional secondary school because of the pressure of the population is very difficult. And I rise to support this motion because this will give us an opportunity. I'll quote examples like we have Langata Barracks, which has a lot of land there, which shouldn't be an issue if we have policies that allow Langata Barracks, for example, to just put aside 5 acres or 3 acres of land to build a secondary school. We have the prisons, we have KWS, we have Nairobi University having a huge chunk of land despite the fact that it is already a settled university. And I want to support this motion because of that, because the only way we can have additional public amenities, hospitals, police station is by having land. Land is a critical, is one of the critical component of development that we need to have. And therefore, I support this motion. And I just want to say that the issue of also having additional finances to acquire these properties, this land, is also a good idea, and I want to support this motion by Honorable Caleb Kositany. Thank you very much.
Honorable members, as you know from your order paper, you will see that this particular motion had a balance of 1 hour 27 minutes. You have run that gauntlet. It is time now for me to call on them.
We must put guidelines on how we are going to expand them. For schools that are being started, we must put criteria for the amount of land required to start.
The Honorable Kositany, did you donate to the member for CI?
Yes, I did. 2 minutes.
Then you will have no time. I shall be the last one to speak. The Honorable member for CI.
Employment elsewhere. So this motion, Mr. Speaker, is timely in the sense that it allows many of our youths who are in the informal sector to get certified, to get training, testing on their final skills, so that they are available for job opportunities and are able to be admitted in various industries. And Mr. Speaker, sir, this one gives them opportunities as well to secure employment in other established companies. Most of them fail to get opportunities to work elsewhere just because they missed proper certificates, proper education documents. And with this motion, it will give them an opportunity once we have apprenticeship centers for testing and allowing them to be certified and the given certificates to enable them secure employment. We have heard a recent article where, I don't know whether it's true or not, where the Qatar government were looking for people with skills in anticipation of the coming World Cup. And whenever we have opportunities outside the country, mostly certificates are needed. And we find most of our youths who are equally well endowed with skills are not able to get the opportunity. Why? Because they do not go through the education system, as it were. So these are some of the benefits of these centers, that it will allow most of our youth to access opportunities even across borders, as Qatar are anticipating to also involve many of Kenyan youth in the preparation for the World Cup. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, many countries, not only Kenya, many countries that have advanced. I got an opportunity to be in Germany and visited John Deere company. And this is some of a good example of how apprenticeship centers have helped the company, most companies in Germany, Italy, Austria, to actually bridge the gap between the workforce and the education systems. And youth are allowed at a very young age to enter into institutions of training to acquire skills in addition to the education they get, while those who have not gone through education sector also get an opportunity to be equipped with skills ready for the workforce.
The Honorable Amisi, you'll have 1 minute, extra minute to just second.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion is quite very progressive, and that's why we have a lot to say about it. But with those few remarks, allow me, Mr. Speaker, to second this motion and urge members of this honorable parliament to second and give them an opportunity to also add their voice. I second, Mr. Speaker.
Very well. Honorable members, allow me to propose the question, which is that, aware that the informal sector constitutes an important component of the economic activities and development process in Kenya, representing about 82.7% of employment in the country, further aware that the workers in the informal sector engage in commercial activities outside the realm of the formally established mechanisms, since there is no clear policy framework in place to regulate the operations by the government, noting that most workers in the informal sector acquire skills and knowledge mainly through apprenticeships, but have no access to technical skills upgrading, as many lack requisite academic certificates, recognizing that apprenticeship in the informal economy represents the main roadmap to skills development in most developing countries, and appreciating that the National Industrial Training Authority, NITA, through its training centers in Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, and Athi River, plays an important role in industrial training targeting workers in the informal and informal sector. This House urges the government to establish suitably located and facilitated training and testing centers in every constituency to assess the experience and competence of the apprenticed workers, particularly in the informal sector, and consider putting in place mechanisms to have them awarded with certificates based on their competencies and acquired skills. Very well, honorable members, remember that you have 5 minutes to go at this. We shall have the first contribution from the Honorable Nderangu Waihenya, member for Roysambu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to congratulate my colleague Jaguar on presenting this motion. Mr. Speaker, in a nutshell, this motion is asking the government to make ways to enable access to technical skills upgrading for the Juakali artisans. Mr. Speaker, this motion is asking the government to establish suitably located facilities for training and testing the Juakali artisans. Mr. Speaker, you will realize that in the Juakali sector, most of the young people who are apprentices there, or informal learners, Mr. Speaker, don't have formal qualifications. For example, KCP certificates and KCSE certificates. So what has happened over time, Mr. Speaker, is that the young people have that experience, 5, 10 years, they have become mechanics, they have become carpenters, but because they have not been formally tested, they have not sat for the government grade tests, it means they cannot access formal jobs that are on offer by the government, in the ministries, in the NGO world. So what happens? The young learners, though qualified, though having experienced, they are denied the opportunity to get formal employment. So Jaguar is requesting the government to make it possible that the young people in the Juakali sector who have experience, who have expertise, who are competent, can now be tested in centers that have been established by the government in every constituency. Mr. Speaker, this will open avenues for now young people who never went to school, who never went to secondary school, who never went for diplomas, to have certificates after their competence has been tested, so that they can be absorbed now formally, and they can be appreciated, and they can upgrade from level 3, from grade 3, grade 2, grade 1. And Mr. Speaker, you know, these are practical industry. You'll go to Gekoba, you'll find the best carpenters in this country. You'll go to Grogon, just here near the roundabout, and Nyayo Market. You'll find the best mechanics. But these young people don't have certificates. Nobody formally recognizes their skills. So what we are saying, can we create institutional capacity within the reach of these young people to be tested in every constituency? I say so because, and I support because, Mr. Speaker, in my own constituency, I know we have very good mechanics in Loisabu. We have very good carpenters at Githurai, particularly at the roundabout. We have many good plumbers in Zimmerman and in Kahawa West. But, Mr. Speaker, they don't have formal certificates. So we are saying perhaps it is even possible, and the government should be persuaded, that in the existing polytechnic